Hey YouTube, Kira's Week here, bringing you all my Jar Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck profile. This is one of the more random decks that I have been working on since Cyber Jar went to 2 on the last Yu-Gi-Oh! Ban list. Definitely a fun deck that focuses on using the wide variety of Jar monsters that we have in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game to use all of their additional flip effects in tandem with some of the added backup support to help with these flip monsters, and there are many different setups that they can do. I know a lot of people are a fan of the Jar monsters, so getting Cyber Jar back to 2 definitely was the inspiration I needed to focus on a deck that, fully utilized this playstyle. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the deck profile. So to start off with our Jar monsters, we're going with the one that is currently at 1 on the Yu-Gi-Oh! Ban list, and that is Morphing Jar. With the flip effect, both players discard as many cards as possible from their hands, and then each player draws 5 cards. So a true hand replenishment card that will make you want to fully invest on your setup on the field once this card is flipped face up, because then you'll be losing your entirety of your hand for 5 brand new cards, which could potentially be new Jar monsters for you to also use in the following turn when you have those cards. For the newest card off of the ban list, we have the Cyber Jar, which is now at 2. With the flip effect, destroy all monsters on the field, and both players reveal the top 5 cards of their deck. Special summon all revealed level 4 or lower monsters in face-up attack or face-down defense, and also add the remaining cards to their hand. If either player has less than 5 cards in their deck, reveal as many as possible. So this card gives you more setup for additional Jar monsters, because you can reveal them and then set them on the field face-down, or if they were non-Jar monsters, in face-up attack position. So depending on what you summon out, the majority of the cards you'll want to summon out in this deck will be the face-down Jar monsters that we reveal, since there are a good majority of them, and then being able to special summon all the revealed monsters as more of a resource to use later on, depending on the card that we special summon. I would say Cyber Jar definitely does help with the plays that you want to go for in the deck with some of the other Jars that we're running in the deck, but another additional Jar we run is Morphing Jar number 2. Now there's one specific Jar monster that I run in the deck that is Dimension Jar, and this card can either be the replacement if you want to run Dice Jar in the deck, or additional copies of Morphing Jar number 2, being one of the more complex ones with the return card effect option for this card, and then being able to use the special summon effect to set up more monsters on the field as well. As I said, this is more particularly a tricky monster to use for its setup, but still an additional good Jar monster to use with all the other ones. For some of the bigger numbers for our Jar monsters, one of the ones I really liked using in the deck was Greed Jar. With the flip effect, you apply these effects in sequence. You excavate any number of cards from the top of your deck up to the number of cards your opponent controls. If you do, add one of them to your hand and send the remaining to the graveyard. More search power for a particular card you may need. And also send monsters from your extra deck to the graveyard up to the number of monsters your opponent controls that were special summoned from the extra deck. You can only use the effect of Greed Jar once per turn, but being able to send monsters from the extra deck to the graveyard gives us access to some extra deck monsters that can gain additional card effects when they're sent to the graveyard for additional destruction of your opponent's cards, or being able to draw off additional cards when they're sent to the graveyard. So you have all these resources available to you with the effect of Greed Jar. We're also running the 3 copies of Reverse Jar. You, with its flip effect, change as many other monsters on the field as possible to face down defense, then return as many face-up spell or trap cards as possible from the field to the hand. Then each player can set spell or traps from the hand up to the number returned to their own hand by this effect. So we do have some face-up traps that we run in this deck. So being able to set and reset some of those cards with other cards that we have in our hand gives us some change around for what we may want to use, and then reset up new cards on the field as well using Reverse Jar, but also just being able to recycle some of our other Jar monsters to be able to reuse again is a big help with this card as well. Now the big thing with this deck also was the playstyle setup of what the main win condition was to be. Aside from just an empty Jar solution, there is some other setup along with the lockdown capabilities of these cards, but before we get to that, we'll go over the remaining Jar monsters, including the 2 copies of Absorbing Jar. With its flip effect, you destroy all set spell or traps on the field, then each player draws 1 card for each of their cards they control that was destroyed by this effect. You cannot set any cards this turn, but most of the time you want Absorbing Jar to resolve on your opponent's turn, so then you don't have to, be worried about the set effect, since it'll be on your opponent's turn. And when your turn comes around, this card is mostly meant just to be as a card to set up with Cyber Jar, and then have the additional destruction effect of your opponent's spell and traps along with your own cards. If you have to set this card on your turn and then flip it on your turn at least, then you can go for the next play, which will be the result of one of the additional jar monsters that we run right after the last of our next monster, which is Dimension Jar. This is more just a banish effect to interrupt some graveyard plays of our opponent, but if you didn't want to run Dimension Jar, you could also run Dice Jar in this specific spot here. Dice Jar being more of a burn damage while taking the risk of using a dice roll to do so, but it's more of a fun play to go off of with this deck as well, and that is what the majority of this deck is, to use the many different flip effects of your jar monsters to interrupt your opponent's plays. Now, for more of the extra deck options we can rely on in this deck, and also limiting our opponent with more lockdown strategies, I'm running 3 copies of Procession of the T-Jar. Face down defense position monsters in this card's column cannot change their battle position. Also, neither player can activate these set cards in spell and trap card zones in this card's column. You can only use each of the following effects of Procession of the T-Jar once per turn. During your main phase, you can move this card to an unused adjacent monster zone. If this card in the monster zone moves to another monster zone, change all other monsters in this card's current column to face down defense. So this is kind of a tricky card to use, but it works well just for the fact that, once again, it is also a tuner monster, so we do have synchro options. It is a level 3 monster, so you can go for rank 3 Xyz plays with some of our other jar monsters. It's meant to be used with the Cyber Jar play setup if our opponent sets a monster down and then plays Procession of the T-Jar to keep that monster locked in its position, but also being able to use the moved adjacent to then reset those cards back face down again as well, and adjust some of the plays for some of the cards in those additional columns that we may not want our opponent to use also. And then we're also running the 3 copies of Ret-Time Reviver Emitter. If this card's in your hand or graveyard, you can target one face-up monster on each field, change them to face-down defense, and if you do, special summon this card, but banish it when it leaves the field. You can only use this effect of Ret-Time Reviver Emitter once per turn. So this is, once again, more or less a recycle card, but also giving us a special summon resource on the field for us to be able to use, recycling those cards, giving us an additional tuner, and then being able to use this tuner, whether it be for a synchro play or another extra deck summon. And also 2 copies of Barrier Statue of Drought. More lockdown for our summons, while the good majority of our cards we run on the deck are Earth and Dark attribute. It doesn't really affect our special summon play if we can at least keep this card on the field, locking down our opponent for any cards they may want to use, and having this card be an additional target for special summoning out onto the field, whether it be face down defense or face up attack using our Cyber Jar. And also to interrupt any of our opponent's other monsters, the small Kaiju engine, which can also potentially be a hand trap spot if you wish in the deck, but more or less just a way to take away our opponent's monsters that can't be affected by our own cards, having the flip and setup effects of our cards be used once we give them a normal main deck monster. And for the spells, we run 3 copies of the Book of Eclipse, more flip and interruption of our opponent's cards, plus the draw power that they go into could help to empty out their deck, but this is once again just another way to set and interrupt any of their plays that they may try to go into. Book of Moon to flip down our own monsters as well to reuse again, especially if we use it on the end phase of our opponent's turn that they flipped into one of our monsters, to flip it again face down. And to prevent our burn damage drain, the 1 copy of Chicken Game along with the Terraforming to search this card out, because then if we have lower life points, we take no damage, then we can just go off of the stall of our jar monsters while this card is on the field, and then also being able to draw into cards by paying life points also. And then 2 copies of Allure of Darkness, along with the 2 copies of Pot of Extravagance, just being able to make use of the extra deck once again for draw power, and then being able to banish some of our dark monsters that we may have multiples of in our hand to draw into more useful cards as well, with the last of the spells being the 1 copy of Pot of Avarice, just for more recycle power for drawing into more cards to be able to make use of again. And then our only traps being the 3 copies of Junk Sleep, once again being a face-up card that we can use with the use of our Reverse Jar, bouncing this card back, and then setting up other spell and traps on the field for us to be able to use then afterwards. And then for the extra deck, for the send cost of our Greed Jar, we are running the 2 copies of Elder Entity and the 1 copy of Garuda. If you send these additional cards, you could have Destruction against your opponent with the 1 Elder Entity set and the Garuda for draw power. There are once per turn, so most of the time, if your opponent just has the 2 extra cards, you could send 1 of each, and then 1 additional monster if they have 3 for what you may want to send off of them. For our synchro options, the 1 Brionac, the 1 Vulcan the Divine, and the 1 Navy Dragon Mech for the synchro plays to be able to use use with our varying level of monsters. If you want to use Navy Dragon Mech for the fact that our Time Reviver is a level 2 tuner, you can always put in Herald of the Arclight instead, with the rest of our monsters being 1 Wind-Ups and Mains, the 1 Ghost Trick Alucard, 1 Dante, and the 1 number 47 for rank 3 plays to go into, with our Link monsters being the 1 SP Little Knight, the 1 Nightmare Cerberus, the 1 Cherubini, the 1 IP Masquerena, and the 1 Nightmare Unicorn. And then as for some of the go-to plays in the deck, the setup with your jar monsters to interrupt your opponent's plays are the big majority of what you can do in this deck. Depending on what jar monster you have to make plays with that monster and set up for the play to go into. So with the flip effect, Cyber Jar being at 2 would be your best bet, because then that destruction can help to, if you reveal other jar monsters, set up more and more of a wall that your opponent has to hurdle over, with the additional jar monsters then being able to resolve and use their own monster effects, giving you more and more resources, whether it be the destruction from your extra deck send or the recycle of your other cards, and then being able to use these said monsters for additional extra deck plays, depending on what you have on the field for them to go into also. But that is it for the deck profile. I hope you all enjoyed. Like I said, this is just a fun iteration of the jar deck that I wanted to make since we had the release of Cyber Jar to 2 on the TCG ban list. And as always, until next time, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and Kira Twig out.